Let's pray. Father, as we consider this example in the Bible, help us to take it and apply it to our own lives. In Jesus' name, amen. So today, I'm bringing the 5-week sermon series to a close. In this series, we've been looking at the 5 most common questions that new Christians in the 18 to 35 age group are asking at the moment. These are like questions which many people would say have got obvious answers, but they're only obvious when you know them. And it reminds me of those puzzle-type questions that we used to get. Things like, what 2 things can you never eat for breakfast? Lunch and dinner. What word would you describe to a man who does not have all his fingers on one hand? Normal, because they're normally spread over 2 hands. You know, you've normally got 2 hands of fingers. Or about the girl who fell off a 50-foot ladder but didn't get hurt. How come was that? Well, she fell off the bottom step. Or this kind of obvious question. If a plane crashes on the border between the United States and Canada, where do they bury the survivors? You don't bury survivors. Or this one, a cowboy rode into town on Friday. He stayed for 3 whole days and rode out again on Friday. How is that possible? His horse was called Friday. You know, there's questions. They're questions which have got easy answers once you know them, but you need to know them. And these questions we're thinking about are a little bit more serious, but they're also important. Over the course of the sermon series, we've looked at these questions. How do I share my faith? How do I find purpose in my work? How can I establish healthy rhythms in my life? And then last week, how do I stay human in inhumane systems? They may sound like quite challenging questions, and actually they are. But as Gary said last week, these are the kind of questions that are actually important to every single one of us. And if you missed any of those talks, you can go back on our YouTube channel and you can watch them. So today I'm thinking about how can I make connections with mentors and peers? In other words, how do I carry on in the faith? And this is basically about how our peers, the people around us, and our mentors can help us in our discipleship. But also how we are called to be mentors to others. This isn't about evangelism. You know, coming to know the good news of Jesus, that he died for us in order that we can have life and life in all its fullness. This isn't about evangelism. This is about discipleship. Learning what life and life in all its fullness actually means in reality. And although I'm using the word mentor here, this isn't like a business mentor. This isn't some kind of organizational structure I'm talking about. This is like a family structure. It's about journeying through life together. And ultimately, mentoring has a strong element of friendship in it. Jesus reminds us in John chapter 15, he tells his disciples they are not his servants, but instead his friends. And the Bible is full of loads of really good examples of mentor relationships. Moses and Joshua, Elisha and Elijah, Eli and Samuel, Mordecai and Esther, Jesus and his disciples, Priscilla and Aquila, who mentor Apollos. But the one I want to focus on today is Barnabas and Saul, or Barnabas and Paul. You may know that later on, after our reading, Saul becomes known as Paul, and he becomes the most effective Christian missionary in the Bible. So if during this sermon I say Paul instead of Saul, forgive me, they're the same person. But in order to learn from Barnabas and Saul, we need to make sure we understand the context. Here we go. I'm going to speed through about 10 chapters of the Bible very, very quickly. Barnabas is a supporter of the early followers of Jesus. We read about him in the book of Acts, chapter 4. And he encourages them in Jerusalem and gives them money to help with the common cause. There we have him in Jerusalem. Undoubtedly, some of the people that Barnabas came into contact with would have been the deacons. They're the ones who've been appointed by the disciples to help with the practical administration of this new emerging faith group. But then one of the deacons, Stephen, is stoned to death in Acts chapter 7. And who should be present at the stoning but a fiery young man called Saul? In fact, he is so zealous for the Jewish faith and so anti-Christian that he actively seeks out to persecute the Christians. And that leads to followers of Jesus dispersing around the known world at that time. That includes, we're told later on in Acts chapter 11, people fleeing to faraway cities like Antioch. Meanwhile, in Acts chapter 9, Saul heads off to Damascus to get involved in a bit of persecution, and we heard a bit about that. And then the first bit of the reading we didn't hear but follows on was about the light flashing around him, and that was when Saul became a follower of Jesus, a Damascus Road experience. It's mentioned in 3 places in the Bible. That's why I didn't get it read this morning, and I also wanted to cut the reading down. But Saul then has to flee Damascus and return back to Jerusalem. He tries to join the disciples. They want nothing to do with him. After all, he's been persecuting them. But then Barnabas gets involved, and he acts as a mediator. Saul starts preaching the good news of Jesus, but that means he ends up with a target on his back. So the disciples send him away to his hometown of Tarsus, and things calm down for a little while in Jerusalem. Not for long, but a little while. And then we moved on to our second reading. Sometime later, probably thought to be about 7 years later, the disciples hear of this group, a mass turning towards Jesus in the city of Antioch. Who better to go and investigate what's happening than good old Barnabas? So off he goes to Antioch. Now, Barnabas sees something amazing happening there, and he realized that these numbers of new believers need guidance in their faith. I guess we're seeing that a bit in the Quiet Revival at the moment. Many people come into faith, they need guidance and help. You could call it discipleship, a mentor. Well, Tarsus is relatively close by, so who does he go and get? He goes to get Saul and brings him back. And here we have one of the most beautiful ironies in the whole of the Bible. Saul arrives in Antioch, the very place where the Jews fled in order to, the followers of Jesus fled in order to escape Saul. And Saul and Barnabas become the spiritual guides. Saul ends up as a spiritual mentor to a church that only came into existence because of his persecution. Wow, God has got an amazing sense of humor. It's quite staggering. And it's here, we're told, in Antioch, that the followers of Jesus, or as they were then called, followers of the way, we heard about that in our first reading, that's where they are first called Christians, followers of Jesus the Christ. It's actually a term of abuse initially. So why did I choose this passage to talk about mentoring and peer support? Well, there's various aspects of it that I think can help us as we think about growing in our faith, and also about helping others to grow in their faith. And the first aspect of mentoring I want to mention is something called submission. Submission. This is about a willingness to learn and to be taught. And I need to start off by pointing out that submitting does not mean allowing yourself to be walked over. That is not what submission is about. It reminds me of the story of the tall, handsome rector on his wedding day. And when he finally gets home with his new wife, he carries her over the doorstep, puts his bride down, and he turns to her and he says, "Now we are home, just so we know where you stand, I want supper on my table at 6:30 every evening when I get home from work. I want you to run me a hot bath and scrub my back. Then I want you to turn back the sheets on the bed and warm the bed and lay out my pajamas. And in the morning, do you know who is going to button my shirt and tie up my tie?" "I certainly do," said his wife. "That will be your funeral director." True Christian submission has nothing to do with oppression and abuse. What does it mean then in this context? Well, submission in this context means following in the dusty footprints of your rabbi and teacher. We know from elsewhere in the Bible that Saul has a very rich academic Jewish heritage. He's even a bit of a protege. He's been taught by the leading rabbi scholar Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a member of the national Jewish leadership for the country. He was widely respected. He comes up somewhere else in Acts as well. Now, Saul also came from pretty good family stock. He was a Jew who also held Roman citizenship. It would have been very easy for a person like this to be proud and arrogant. And to be fair, we do occasionally get glimpses of that in some of his letters and other things. And yet something has changed in Saul. Something humbles Saul. Maybe it was his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. Maybe it was the oppression and being sent away to Tarsus or something else. Whatever it was, Saul submits to Barnabas being his mentor. He is prepared to be taught and learn things from Barnabas. Now for me, in my life, I had a similar relationship with a former colleague. He had far, far more experience than I did as a vicar, although perhaps I had more worldly experience. But as my team rector, we worked together, and he mentored me. He also happened to be the rural dean for the area, and when he needed an assistant rural dean, he took me on. I learnt a lot from him. I learnt so much, not least how to relate and lead others who weren't always easy to lead or relate to. So there's something in this Bible account about submission, a willingness to learn and be taught. But interestingly, it's not just Saul who demonstrates submission. So does Barnabas. You know, firstly in Acts chapter 4, he submits to the authority of the apostles. He gives them a significant amount of money to help the common cause. And then in the passage we heard, it was the apostles who sent Barnabas to Antioch. So there's something about submission. There's also a big thing about encouragement. If you look back to Acts chapter 4, when he is first converted, Barnabas provides encouragement. In actual fact, his name wasn't Barnabas. We're told it's Joseph. He's a Levite, a Jew from Cyprus. And we're told that his name is changed by the apostles to Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a kind of nickname. Now, the thing about good nicknames is they say something about a person. And as far as Barnabas' nickname goes, son of encouragement, it's a lot better than the nicknames I used to have. So when I was in a hockey team that I played for, my nickname was Jimmy the Nose, or the Nose. The only reason I could balance a hockey stick on my nose. When I became a teacher, I was renowned for being very strict. And the pupils at the school gave me the nickname Scroogey Trudy, just after Ebenezer Scrooge. You know, a good nickname says something about a person. Being called Barnabas by the apostles was like a nickname. And then in the second Bible passage we heard, Barnabas was sent to Antioch to encourage the new church. And we read in verse 23 that he did exactly that. But let's think about this from Saul's perspective. Who is the person who initiates his first meeting with the apostles when they don't want to talk to him? Barnabas, the encourager. Later, when Saul is sent back to Tarsus, his hometown, he must have been feeling really flat. You know, he left Tarsus earlier on in a blaze of glory to study under a great teacher, Gamaliel. And yet now he seems to be back home in the family business of tent making, working with his bare hands. It must have seemed like to him that he isn't going to have the life he expected. It must seem like this amazing education he had is being wasted. But our God is the God who redeems us, turns things around, and chooses us for his work. While Saul is there languishing in Tarsus, Barnabas turns up. And he wants Saul to come and help him, to use the amazing education he had, even his fiery zeal, but for God's glory. That must be such an encouragement to Saul. You see, good mentors encourage others to grow. I've still got a mentor like that. Her name's Pauline. She's my spiritual companion. We meet every 3 months online. And she encourages me to reflect on what God is doing in my life and encourages me to keep growing. The third aspect of a good mentor also links to what I've just been talking about. And I'm calling it cultivation and direction. It's like cultivating a fruit tree. It's about training and giving opportunities to grow. A bit like sponsorship. Barnabas is sponsored by the apostles to go to Antioch. Saul is sponsored by Barnabas, and he's given the opportunities and the connections that follow on from that. A good sponsor or mentor will build bridges for you and provide opportunities for your growth. And the funny thing is, it was only when I was writing this sermon that I realised that was exactly what my training incumbent taught me when I was a curate. He taught me how to cultivate relationships and connections. He gave me opportunities to grow. He directed my learning with these opportunities. So, for example, and some of you will already know this, one of the highlights of my year, every year, is leading the Alpha course. I've now led around 30 Alpha courses with hundreds of people attending them over the years. I've taught other people around the country how to lead Alpha courses. But this all started with the direction of my first training vicar. Up to then, I had a really negative opinion of Alpha. But then one day Peter said to me, he said, "Jim, I want you to lead the Alpha course at this church." And the rest is history. A good mentor recognizes where another person is on their journey. They provide cultivation and direction. Now, only later will there be a transfer of the power dynamic. And at the end of our reading, we see a bit of that. Paul and Saul head off on a missionary journey together. It's the first missionary journey, and Barnabas starts by taking the lead. And if you read through it, you see that. It's only later that Paul takes over. And you can almost imagine the situation. Learning from someone, having the chance to practice skills, and then being given the chance to lead. And it's sometimes phrased like this: I do, you watch. We do it together. You do it, I watch. And I know there's a fourth box there. I'll come back to that in a little while. But it may interest you to know that that principle of observe, work together, take the lead, that principle is pretty much embedded in pretty much every area of training within the Church of England. From the training at theological colleges through to even the training at the House of Bishops. And I know there's a fourth box, we'll come back to that. But we see in this also a pattern of mentoring in the secular world. If you train in education, or nursing, or medicine, observe, work together, take the lead. That's what it means in part by cultivation and direction in mentorship. And it means there is this ongoing partnership. This is really important, ongoing process. As Saul comes to lead alongside Barnabas, it becomes a training ground for a missionary team. In the future, they will work together as peers to start to change the world around them. That is when Saul becomes Paul. And that's where we get to that fourth box there. You do, I support and train others. Because when Paul and Barnabas eventually part ways, they both carry mentoring going forward. Barnabas mentors John Mark. Paul mentors Silas, or Silvanus as he's also known, Timothy, Titus, and a whole load of other people. In fact, if you look at his letters, it's clear how Paul keeps up long-distance mentoring. And it's that mentoring, starting there, that allows the church to grow and to thrive and ultimately end up here at Walsall with you. That's the chain. So now we think a little bit about relevance and practice. We can see it's relevant to us. Like I said at the start, this is not an organizational kind of structure. It's more about a family structure. It's about journeying through life together. And that means that quite often our mentors will only be a short way further on the journey from us. Saul mentors the people he used to persecute. He's perhaps only a little further than them in the Christian faith, although he brings a lot of knowledge from his background with him. So let's think about some practical aspects. Part of my work as a Christian Part of my work as a leader in this church, part of my work as an archdeacon, associate archdeacon, is to be a mentor. I mentor a whole variety of different people. You might call it discipleship, take your pick. That includes those who are becoming leaders in church life, alpha group helpers and leaders, ordinands, people training for ordination, curates, new vicars, even rural deans and archdeacons. These are all people I'm involved with discipleship with, mentoring, and they can be both formal and informal mentorships. So what does a good mentor look like? What does a good mentor look like? Well, it's someone who has been there before us and is a few steps ahead of us on their journey. Someone who is not perfect. You know, we can often learn more from those who do and have made mistakes. They're not perfect, but they're trying to become better. Someone who will invest in us. Someone who will ask questions, even the uncomfortable questions, but they do it with love. Someone who listens to us. Someone who is still growing in their faith. That's what a good mentor looks like. And if you look around church, you can think of people who are good mentors to others. And then there's tools that I've found helpful in mentoring, both as a mentee and a mentor. How do I make these connections with my peers? Well, I found prayer triplets and Bible study in small groups really, really helpful. So, for example, at the start of every meeting, I meet with Bishop Tim Wimbunya, our bishop, once every month. At the start of every meeting, we study the Bible together. Home groups and Bible study groups are a great place to have peer mentoring, to teach, to support, to share wisdom, to reflect, and importantly, to grow in your own relationship with God. See, being a disciple and a mentor means a willingness to submit, encourage, cultivate, and direct. But all of it relies on a willingness to engage. If you consider the people who stand at the front of this church and preach from week to week, they were involved in other areas of discipleship and growth before and mentoring before they preached. So in conclusion, the good news of the Bible is that Jesus died for us so that we can come into a full relationship with God. We can have life, and life in all its fullness. But if we only ever think about this as, well, what can I get out of this? Then we're falling short of being a disciple. And perhaps that might be a lesson that Saul learnt when he was in Tarsus. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be disciples, his disciples. That means we are all involved in mentoring. We cannot be true followers of Jesus if we're only learning from those who have gone before us as our mentors. We're also called to mentor those following us. Barnabas guided Paul during his development from a novice follower of Jesus to become the greatest propagator of the faith in the early church. Barnabas and Paul each accepted their roles as a mentor and a mentee, disciples together. And they adapted them as they progressed through the process. So, if you think you could be involved in these kind of things, we're always looking for people to take opportunities. As a church leadership team, we've been talking about supporting people who want to grow as leaders. We'll probably be using the Growing Leaders course next year again. So if you feel called to be involved in a home group facilitation or children's church or helping on Alpha and so on, or to be involved in the band or even lead the band or a service or even to preach, speak to others, speak to me, find out, start that journey of how you might get there. Perhaps you're even feeling called to ordination, to become a vicar or a priest or a deacon. Speak to me. Don't let it go past. I would even dare to say, like Paul does in one of his letters, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. This is not about trying to be about being perfect, but this is about trying to be better. It's about being on a journey. And for me, it's about living alongside others. I've got 5 foundational verses that form my ministry, the basics of my ministry. One of them is this: so deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. Barnabas took the initiative. His willingness to live alongside and mentor someone helped Paul grow into a key leader of the church. So the questions I want to leave with you today are quite simple, but quite hard, like good questions are. Who are your mentors? Who are you mentoring? Are you growing as a disciple? And if not, what are you going to do about it? Amen.